An ecosystem is a community of organisms and their physical environment interacting together. Environment involves both living organisms and the non-living physical conditions. These two are inseparable but interrelated. The living and the physical components are linked together through nutrient cycles and energy flows. An ecosystem includes all the living things like plants, animals, and organisms in a given area interacting with each other and with the non-living environment like weather, earth, sun, soil, climate, atmosphere, etc. In an ecosystem, each organism has its own role to play. Ecosystems are the foundations of the biosphere and they determine the health of the entire Earth system. An ecosystem may be of very different size. It may be a whole forest as well as a small pond. An ecosystem may be as large as a Great Barrier Reef or as small as back of a spider's crab shell which provides a home for plants and animals like sponges, algae, worms, etc. The ecosystem boundaries are not marked by a rigid line. Ecosystems are often separated by geographical barriers such as deserts, mountains, oceans, lakes, and rivers. As these borders are not rigid, the ecosystems tend to blend into each other. The organisms in an ecosystem are usually well balanced with each other and with their environment. An ecosystem may be natural or artificial, land-based or water-based. Artificial systems may include cropland, a garden, a park, or an aquarium. The introduction of a new species into a ecosystem can have a disastrous result, eventually leading to the collapse of an ecosystem and the death of many of its native species. The term ecosystem was proposed by E.G. Tansley in 1935, who defined it as the system resulting from the integration of all the living and non-living factors of the environment. Odum defined ecosystem as the structural and functional unit of ecology. The abiotic components of an ecosystem, they are the non-living components of an ecosystem. It includes climatic factors like air, water, sunlight, rainfall, temperature, and humidity. The edaphic factors like soil, air, soil water, and soil pH. The topographic factors like latitude and altitude. The organic components consist of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and humic substances, and inorganic substances like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The biotic components of an ecosystem are the living components like plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria. It consists of producers. They are the autotrophic components, the organisms which can manufacture the organic compounds from simple inorganic components through photosynthesis. The consumers are the heterotrophic components. They are the organisms which consume the producers. They are also called as the macro consumers. These includes herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores of primary, secondary, and tertiary level. And the third one is the decomposers, also called as micro consumers. These includes bacteria and actinomycetes, which decompose the producers as well as the consumers. Energy flow in ecosystem. The energy flow in the ecosystem is one of the major factors that support the survival of such a great number of organisms. For almost all organisms on Earth, the primary source of energy is the solar energy. It is amusing to find that we receive less than 50% of the sun's effective radiation on Earth. When we say effective radiation, we mean the radiation which can be used by the plants to carry out the photosynthesis. The chemical energy of the food is the main source of energy required by all living organisms. This energy is transmitted to the different trophic levels along the food chain. The energy flow is based on two different laws of thermodynamics. The storage and the loss of energy in an ecosystem is based on two basic laws of thermodynamics. The law of thermodynamics in the ecosystem explains the flow of energy at each trophic level. The first law states that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It can only be converted from one form to another. This is true in energy flow in the ecosystem. For example, in photosynthesis, the product of starch is formed by the combination of reactions by the chlorophyll, water, carbon dioxide. The energy stored in the starch is acquired from the external source, that is the light energy, and so there is no gain or no loss in total energy. Here the light energy is converted into chemical energy. The second law of thermodynamics states that there is a loss of energy at each step of energy flow. This law also stands true in ecology, as there is a progressive decrease in energy at each trophic level. Linderman in 1942 proposed a law called 10% law. It states that during transfer of food energy from one trophic level to other, only about 10% is stored at each and every level, and the rest of the 90% is lost in respiration, decomposition, and in the form of heat. Hence, this law is called as 10% law. Trophic levels in an ecosystem. Trophic levels, they are the position of an organism in the food chain. The producers and the consumers in the ecosystem can be arranged into different feeding groups and are known as trophic levels or the feeding levels. The producers or the plants represent the first trophic level. The herbivores or the primary consumers which represent the second trophic level. The primary carnivores or the secondary consumers represent the third trophic level. The top carnivores or tertiary consumers represent the last trophic level. Food chain. The movement of energy from producers up to the top carnivores. There are basically three different types of food chains in the ecosystems, and they are grazing food chain, saprophytic or detritus food chain, and parasitic food chain. Grazing food chain. In this type of food chain, energy flow takes place from producers to the herbivores, that is the primary consumers, and then to the carnivores, that is secondary consumers, and ultimately to the top carnivores. In grassland ecosystem, the food chain here, the food is transferred from grasses and plants to the grasshopper, which is the primary consumer or consumer of first order, and then to the frog, that is the consumer of second order, and then to the snake, that is the consumers of third order, and ultimately to the hawk, that is the top carnivore. Detritus or saprophytic food chain. Here, the dead organic matter occupies the lowermost level of the food chain, followed by the decomposers, and so on. The organisms that feed on the dead organic matter or detritus are also known as detrivores or decomposers. And these detrivores are later eaten by the predators, as you can see in this illustration. In a parasitic food chain, it begins with a herbivore, but food energy is transferred from larger creature to smaller organisms without killing in the event of a predator. A tiny creature consumes a portion of larger host and may be parasitized by even smaller species in a parasitic food chain. In this illustration, the food is transferred from the producers to the herbivores like fruit-eating birds, then to the parasite present on the herbivores like lice and the bugs, and then to the hyperparasites present on the lice and the bugs. This is bacteria and fungi. A food web is the natural interconnection of food chains and a graphical representation of what eats what in an ecological community. The linkages in a food web illustrate the feeding pathways, such as where heterotrophs obtain organic matter by feeding and autotrophs and other heterotrophs. The food web is a simplified illustration of the various methods of feeding that link an ecosystem into unified system of exchange. Ecological pyramids, they are the graphic representation of the trophic structure at successive trophic levels. They show the relative amount of various parameters such as the number of organisms, energy, biomass across trophic levels. Ecological pyramids can also be called as trophic pyramids or energy pyramids. The pyramids, either it could be upright or inverted depending upon the type of the ecosystem. So in this example, these are the pyramids with respect to the different ecosystems, where T1 represents the producers, T2 herbivores, T3 secondary consumers, T3 tertiary consumers. So A represents a grassland ecosystem, B represents pond ecosystem, C represents forest ecosystem, and D represents parasitic ecosystem. So these are the pyramids of biomass. It is a graphical representation of the amount of organic material, that is the biomass, present at each successive trophic level in an ecosystem. Again, A represents grassland ecosystem, B for forest ecosystem, and C an inverted pyramid for pond ecosystem. What are the functions of ecosystems? Ecosystem function is the capacity of natural processes and components to provide goods and services that satisfy human needs either directly or indirectly. Four different types of ecosystem services have been distinguished by scientific communities. That is provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. Provisioning services. These services consist of all the products obtained from the ecosystems like food and raw materials, genetic resources, medicinal resources, as well as ornamental resources. The food and raw materials like crops, wild foods, the raw materials like lumber, skin, fuel wood, organic matter, fodder, fertilizer, etc. The genetic resources consist of the crop improvement genes and healthcare. The medicinal resources includes pharmaceuticals, chemical models, and test as well as assay organisms. The ornamental resources consist of fashions, handicraft, jewelry, pets, worships, decoration, and souvenirs like furs, feathers, ivory, orchids, butterflies, aquarium fish, shells, etc. The regulating services. These services are the benefits obtained from the regulation of ecosystem processes. Consists of purification of water and air. For example, in wetlands ecosystem, uh, it purifies water by trapping sediments and removing nutrients and harmful chemicals. On the journey to the watershed, tiny sediment particles settle as the water begins to slow. Plants absorb nutrients as the stream flows or runoff water passes through their roots. When the plants die, the nutrients are recycled. Carbon sequestration and climate regulation. It is a process of capturing and fixing carbon dioxide in terrestrial ecosystem. It supports the growth of above the ground vegetation and soil formation by forming carbon sinks. This maintains a healthy ecosystem and brings multiple benefits such as climate regulation, soil conservation, etc. Then predation regulation by the prey populations. Prey controls the predator populations because predators depend entirely on prey populations to survive. Predators also control prey populations and do so directly by reducing the size of those populations if a prey population is fragile and healthy. Predators will be able to find them more easily and consume them, and so the predator populations will increase. As the predator population increases, they put more pressure on the prey population and the prey population begins to decline. Another service is the biological control of pests and diseases. The predators and parasites play an important role in ecosystem by regulating pests and diseases that are harmful to the plants, animals, and people. Then pollination mechanisms. The pollination is a vital ecological service provided by the wide range of insect species including bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, beetles, and moths. Supporting services. They are the services that allow for the other ecosystem services to be present. They have indirect impact on humans and last over a long period of time. For example, nutrient cycling. A nutrient cycle is defined as the cyclic pathway by which the nutrient pass through in order to recycle and reutilized. The pathway comprises cells, organisms, community, and ecosystem. The nutrients consumed by the plants and animals are returned to the environment after death and decomposition, and the cycle continues. Soil microbes decompose organic matter to release nutrients, which can be taken up by the plant roots. Nutrient cycling rate depends on the various biotic, physical, and chemical factors. For example, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, oxygen cycle, etc. Then primary production. The primary productivity is defined as the rate at which the solar energy is converted into organic substances through the process of photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. There are two aspects of primary productivity, that is gross primary productivity, where the total amount of energy produced in an ecosystem. The net primary productivity, it is the amount of energy used by the producers for respiration. Then soil formation. This is also called as pedogenesis. The soil is one of our essential natural resource. It is the home to many microorganisms. It is the uppermost layer of the earth's crust. It is made up of minerals, organic materials, air and water. Leaves and organic constituents decompose to form the upper organic layer, known as humus. The mineral from which the soil is formed is termed as the parent material. The parent material is chemically or physically weathered and transported, which then deposits to form layers of soil. Then flood regulation. The ecosystems have a natural capacity to decrease both severity and frequency of floods. Natural flood regulation processes along freshwaters can be attributed to two different mechanisms. That is flood prevention that takes place in the whole catchment, and flood mitigation once the water has accumulated in the stream. Cultural services. In the global assessment, cultural ecosystem services are included as a part of both material and non-material nature's contribution to the people. It includes cultural services like nature in books, films, painting, folklore, advertising, etc. With respect to the spiritual services, nature for religious as well as heritage value. Then recreational aspects like ecotourism, outdoor sports and recreation. The science and education like natural system for school excursions and scientific discoveries. Then therapeutic services like ecotherapy, social forestry and animal assisted therapy, etc.